Thank you very much. What a pleasure to talk to you, John. I've been really looking forward to this, as I'm sure everyone has told you. Hopefully, they told you. I'm such a big fan of the show. So,
Thank
congratulations,
you.
first of all.
Thank you very much, and thank you. You were in my life every night through COVID for many, many years. So appreciate all of that information and the work that you did to keep us all informed. Very important.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm someone who watches a lot of these shows, going back to, St. Elsewhere days
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Chicago Hope, obviously ER, and even a little bit of Grey's Anatomy, although that was more my teenage daughters, to be perfectly honest. John, this is the best medical show I've ever seen. It really is, and I hope you hear it a lot. I think you do because I've read articles about this, but it's a lot harder to do than I think people realize.
Yeah, we're very fortunate. We work with a number of physicians. We had done that on ER, but
Yeah.
at that time we were still having to do a certain amount of medical melodrama, which is a wonderful form, but not what we were interested in. We wanted to just talk about how difficult it is for a physician in a major urgent urban hospital to actually get through a shift, what we actually ask them to do that we're not aware of. And so we have a lot of medical personnel on the show. We have one of our senior writers, executive producers is Dr. Joe Sachs, who was 30 years, has been a 30-year emergency room attending, at UCLA and at other places. And then we have 4 other working emergency room physicians who are on set. We have Dr. Mel Herbert, who's a very well-known ER doc, who's in the writer's room with Dr. Joe. And then we have 9 ER nurses, working ER nurses, who are in the show as all of our regulars. So when you see, the medical procedures and it looks right, that's because they're actually the ones who are doing much of it. They're leaving shifts and coming in and working on our show. And we have a fantastic prop department, but we put a lot of care into trying to really show what that experience is for an emergency room physician and for the nurses in the emergency rooms.
John, I'm curious, you talk about this sort of coming out of COVID, and, I was very immersed in COVID, and I get the sense that not only have many people moved on, there's almost a desire to not revisit.
Yeah.
Was that a rate limiting step at all as you were thinking about this show? Were there naysayers?
No, they really weren't. We had a lot of freedom from Max, from the wonderful people at Max, and they were very supportive of what we were trying to do. There are scenes in the piece that show Dr. Robbie, who's played by Noah Wiley, in full, COVID protective gear, and those are all based on the photographs that Joe Sachs shared with us from UCLA Northridge, where he was working through it. And, so all of that kind of attention to detail, everyone was very supportive of. I mean, I like to talk about, and I may sound a little overblown in this, but, I think the Kaiser Health News and Foundation found out that we lost 3,600 U.S. healthcare workers during COVID. And they are our medical combat veterans. They went and did something to save everybody else, and we've forgotten to take care of them in the way that we should. The PTSD, the trauma that many have experienced, the nursing shortages that have come out of it. I think we have to take a moment to really think about what we asked them as our first responders to do. It was very heroic, and we have tended to forget about it. So if we can bring a little bit more attention back to that on this show, that was a big part of what we set out to do.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about scripted drama versus documentaries or docuseries. With documentaries, you clearly there's some point that you're trying to convey. Maybe even there's advocacy around it. With scripted dramas, the North Star seems to be you want to entertain people, right? How do you find that line? Because what you're describing sounds like, look, you wanted to pay respect and homage to these healthcare workers, and yet you want to make a really engaging, entertaining, highly watchable show at the same time.
I think we're curious about it. And one of the things that we've heard from the medical community is that it's been an opportunity for them to simply show their families what it is they do. And I think that audiences are really curious about these positions, about the jobs and the way that it does. And they're very aware when it doesn't feel real. I mean, obviously, this is artifice. We built a set on Warner Brothers, and And, it's all props, and it's, prosthetics, and, all of the things that we do. And we have introduced a number of entertaining characters and things, but we wanted that authenticity, that feeling. At first, people were very concerned about how graphic a lot of it is, because we're really showing the medicine. And we titrated it in, we brought it in kind of slowly so that the audience would get more used to seeing it as it went on, in the same way that you do if you're a physician. You come in and you start to see it, you start to feel it. And people at the beginning had always told me they were putting their hands over their eyes in the first few episodes. And by a few episodes in, they were actually just realizing the emotional experience of what the physicians and nurses are going through. So, you're trying to get at that. But we're not doing an entertaining show, but we're also not asking you to eat your vegetables. We're showing you some really fascinating characters and what they do, which is an extraordinary skill set, very difficult, and deserves a lot of our admiration.
Were there lines that would come up in the writer's room, certain things where you say, we won't cross? I'll give an example. I remember when I was interviewing someone about a scripted drama some time ago, the idea of a child dying in a television show, that is a tough line to cross. That is tough sledding for the viewer. Were there lines like that you thought about, and if so, can you share any of those?
Well, there's always been and in fact, that was a case on ER all those years ago in 1994 with Michael Crichton. One of the things we talked about was that there was concerns at NBC that people were dying in the emergency room. And we said, well, people die in the emergency room and the audience knows it. So let's respect the audience's intelligence and their willingness. So, no, we didn't get pushback, but we also didn't want it to be so overwhelmingly bleak that you didn't also see successes. You didn't also see, what the characters are going through. But we really tell the stories purely from the point of view of the physicians. We don't ever follow any of the patients when they're not connected with the physicians. And that allows us, I think, to kind of tell the arc of what a day is like and the emotions of that day, and particularly for the younger, interns and med students who are in there, what they're learning. So it gives you more latitude. But no, nobody ever told us not to do it. But we knew not to kill, a child at an episode for 15 episodes.
Right. I mean, it's a lot, and yet it's the reality of what happens in ERs. There was a particular scene, and I think it's a little different than the ones that I've seen written about, that really struck me. And it has to do with a child who's found at the bottom of a pool. And it's tragic, but it's also the story of that child's grandmother, who was to have been watching that child. And it's also the story of the fact that there are certain markers in the emergency room, in this case, a potassium level in one's blood that is from which one is irrecoverable. You can't survive that. And it was so gripping, the entire scene, and then the way Noah basically tells the parents what happened. I mean, even as I'm talking to you about it now, it conjures up a lot of emotions in me. As a neurosurgeon, there's been times when I've had to go down to the emergency room and deliver the worst news to somebody. They were having a perfectly fine day just a few hours earlier, and now it is the worst day of their lives. It is hard to convey that, I feel, in a television show, and yet you guys have done it.
Again, the quality of the writing, Joe Sachs, Dr. Joe Sachs, Scott Gemmell, the entire writing staff spends a lot of time talking to physicians and nurses about how they have to deliver these news, what the feelings are that they go through. And we're really just trying to accurately portray that difficulty. The scenes, interestingly, a couple of the scenes or stories that go over a number of episodes that we've heard a tremendous amount about, in addition to that, are end-of-life story and making the decisions about your parents, which all of us go through. And I think it gives the audience an opportunity to think about it. We heard from a lot of people that they wanted to have conversations. We've gotten a lot of emails and texts and things and seen things online that it spurred people to talk to their parents and to talk to their children about what they want. Noah wrote a beautiful episode. He's also a wonderful writer, in which, that episode in which he tells the children, the adult children of the parent who's dying or, should be taken off life support, a way in which to deal with that, which was beautiful. I'd never heard it before, a Hawaiian saying. And, those kinds of things, when we can, that gets us into this human experience, that's what we're trying to do.
Has it surprised you, the response to this show?
Yeah, completely. all of us.
Really?
Yeah. No, we had no idea. And part of that is because we said we took a risk, and Max took a risk with us to say we were going to just take you through a shift. Now, obviously, it's a very dramatic shift, and not every emergency room shift is like this shift, but we're going to try and take you through a shift and see what happens to the people, and that you can get to know them over in the way that you would get to know someone over 14 or 15 hours, not over months. It's not about their relationships outside of the hospital. It's about their work life. And we all have these work families where we spend so much time with the people we work with. They become our other group of people that we share with. And so I think it's all still settling in on us that there's an audience that's responded to what we're trying to do.
I mean, hugely so, John. I don't want to blow smoke up your skirt, but I talk to a lot of doctors, and I work in a hospital, and you can tell when the conversations beyond what we're doing in the operating room are about this show. What you did is hard. Being a viewer, but also talking to a lot of people to really bring reality to the screen like that is challenging. I mean, I really congratulate you for it, because I think there's a tendency to want to pull punches, especially when it comes to medical shows. Like, oh, we can't show them that. We can't get that deep into it. That'll turn them off. It's too graphic. Whatever it might be, but I get the sense there were no punches that were pulled.
We didn't have those restrictions, and I would also say that I think the audience is very sophisticated and video literate. Have seen narrative, have seen it. They've watched a lot of documentaries. It's not the same world that we were in 30, 40 years ago. It's a world in which people have seen these things. They have access to, you can look up right now. You can look up a thoracotomy on YouTube, and people do. And there are lots of photos, and there's actually videos of it. The audience is not to be underestimated. And I think oftentimes we do underestimate their intelligence and their interest. We started the show, in the first few minutes with a degloved foot from a subway accident. And that was very intentionally done to say, this is what's going to be like. We understand you may not want to be part of that, and we want to tell you early in case this show isn't for you. But people stuck around and came back and stayed. And, we had Dr. Joe tells a funny story, Dr. Joe Sachs, where he heard from another physician who was angry because he felt that we had violated some HIPAA protections by showing real footage that we had gotten someone to give us. And we said, no, it's all photographed on set. It's all prosthetics and done in camera.
That real.
It's that real. So, yeah.
I think a lot of people will draw comparisons to ER, but there's another show that you worked on as well, The West Wing, which in some ways was very real as well. I mean, it felt like you were in The West Wing, and it was around the time of the Clinton White House. Are there parallels? Again, I hesitate to use the word advocacy, because these are supposed to be entertaining shows, scripted dramas. And yet, I think there's these messages that you're trying to impart, certainly with The Pit. Is West Wing a good comparison in this regard?
Yeah, I think the first show that I worked on that did well, that I was very proud of being involved with, was China Beach. And that was about nurses and doctors in Vietnam. And John Young and a number of people who worked on that show, Bill Broyles, insisted upon us actually talking to real vets and getting their real stories. And so what I've discovered is you don't need to do advocacy, because the stories that you get from the people who really do something, who really do the thing, whether that be on the West Wing with all of the various political advisors that we had that worked on the show throughout, or on ER or The Pit or China Beach, they tell you the stories, and you don't have to reach for advocacy. You don't have to try and find a theme in the room that we're then going to try and do, because in the case of The Pit, the medicine itself and what the experiences are that people tell you, then turn towards that advocacy. One of the examples on The Pit is that one of the things we started here very early on was about violence against nurses and healthcare workers in the emergency room, and towards paramedics, which I was surprised by, and I guess there's even a legislation that's been passed to try and make it a federal crime to attack a healthcare worker, who's trying to provide support. And that became one of our themes that we wanted to write about. So, you didn't have to do it. We never wanted to write about gun control, and yet what we did want to write about was the people who have to clean up after gun violence. And the people in emergency rooms, the paramedics who bring them in, and the people in the emergency rooms are the people who have the unenviable job of actually trying to save people who've been, And so you don't have to be, we never said gun control. We never talked about it. We're just saying there are people who actually have to deal with the consequences of some of our actions. And we did that a lot on West Wing. There was a lot about talking about issues. Who does it really impact? And I have a lot of examples of sitting in rooms with political consultants, people who'd worked in the White House or who were working in the White House, and I would very cavalierly bring up something that I wanted to do, and then they would get into an argument about what the problems are with it, like raising the Social Security age, which seemed like an easy thing for me, and then I just absolutely got destroyed by someone who had worked with the sheet metal workers union for years, who said, like, well, okay, your intellectual workers can take a 67 or a 70-year-old retirement, but my 60-year-old who spent his entire life or her entire life on her knees, installing carpet or cutting sheet metal, they're done at 60. Right. So what are you talking about?
Right.
So, so you got to if you start to have the conversations with the people who really do it, you get all these different points of view, and you don't have to try and, you just present what the ramifications are of some of the decisions we make, and let the audience draw their own conclusions.
Did any of that happen on this show? I mean, you deal with vaccination for measles. You deal with medication abortion. You do deal with mass shootings and all that. Were there deliberate discussions or debates even about some of these issues in the writers' room?
All of them, and we bring in people who work in that field, both in medicine and public policy, and they talk to us. So right now we're preparing the next season. And
congratulations, by the way. Can't
thank
wait.
you very much. And we had two different lengthy conversations yesterday in the writers' room with public health advocates for various issues. And part of what we're asking is, what's the counter argument? What's the people felt very strongly in all of our conversation about masks, and the one story that came out that we ended up playing was, if you don't believe in masks, do you want the surgeons to wear masks in surgery?
Right.
Which was just too delicious to not put it in the show.
These are contentious issues, some of them. Do you get blowback from members of the audience at all?
Not so far. We've been anticipating it, and I assume at some point we will.
Anti-vaxxers or Second Amendment folks, anything?
Haven't so far, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. One of the things about these shows now is this show is going to be on Max now for years.
Right.
And so people are going to start to catch up to it more. And, when we were doing West Wing almost every Friday morning, I got a letter from Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska's office, who never missed an episode and then would argue with me about whatever we had on the show. But his position was, I'm going to tell you what my position is on this.
Wow.
I'm not telling you wrong. I'm just saying there is another point of view, and I want to tell you what that other point of view is. And I do worry that we've moved just as a country, and part of this may be the trauma of COVID and the stress and the way in which everybody's lived through that process, that we are in an era where we don't discuss this much.
Right.
And so part of our intent on this in this show was to just show what these workers do, what these wonderful healthcare workers do. You make your argument from their point of view with what they have to go through. So
so many scenes are very procedural, like you see, as you talked about, someone putting in a chest tube for a pleural effusion, someone getting a gunshot wound, whatever it might be. How hard is it to train the actors to do these things?
Well, we started with Noah did it for 15 years on ER. Right. So he's actually, if you have a facial laceration, Noah's the person you want to sew it up. He's great at suturing. But the other actors and Noah, for kind of a refresher, we did 2 weeks with all the physicians, came in and trained them on the basic procedures, full basically kind of the obvious things like the CPR, which is the hardest thing to do on television because you really can't break any of the actors' ribs that you're trying to do CPR with. But so that's the biggest criticism we always get is, we're not our wrists aren't breaking right or whatever, but we're also not hurting any of the actors who are on the show. But yeah, they came in for 2 weeks, 2 full weeks, full days with all the doctors and nurses, and they trained them on all those basic procedures. And then we do full medical rehearsals as we go for each procedure, where the doctors come in, whoever's the doctor on that episode comes in with full ground plans and everything. And they do it all before I'm one of the directors, and so before the directors step in, the doctors have actually made it exactly the way it's supposed to be. And then it's our responsibility to shoot around what it actually looks like, not to try and conform the medicine to what we need to do with the camera, but to make the camera show what the medicine actually is.
Was it ever too much for any of the actors?
The dexterity of it was a lot sometimes. There's a lot of medical dialogue, and we try really hard not to dumb down that medical dialogue. So it's doctors talking to doctors or nurses talking to nurses and doctors. But you're doing that, and you're also, trying to do some very specific medical procedure. So, which involves a lot of, trauma, a lot of kind of trauma triage stuff. So, yeah. Sometimes it's like, wait a second, I'm trying to rub the top of my head and chew gum and do medical dialogue at the same time. But they're really great, and everybody jumped into it really excited about it. We kid that we all know just enough to be terrified in an emergency room. We don't actually know how to really do anything.
And it's a 15-hour shift, so it's 1 hours. How did that decision get made?
We wanted to show the reality of how patients move through the ER and why when you wait for 8 hours in the waiting room, there's a reason you're waiting for 8 hours in the waiting room. That when we were only going to deal with the medicine in the time period that it takes. So the whole day is actually, we have a wonderful on-set nurse, Tim Van Pelt, who ran one of the major emergency rooms here in Los Angeles, retired recently, he came to us, and he actually blocks out all of the patients, every single one, along with Dr. Joe Sachs, every single one of our background artists has a diagnosis, has a schedule on every hour of when their meal is going to come, when their X-rays are coming back, when they'll get it. So we're trying to get across this idea of what really happens when you're frustrated out there, what they're doing in the back. That nobody's playing back there; they're just trying to get through the day, and so that was really intent. Like, here's how do you survive? And so by the time we were shooting episodes 10, 11, 12, we were talking about being tired on our feet, and how do you, when you haven't really had a chance to eat, and do you ever get to go to the bathroom, and just try to really show what these experiences are for these healthcare workers we depend upon.
There's relationships, obviously, between the physicians and the patients. There's relationships between the physicians, trainees, and attendings. And it's just so spot on. There's the issue of the nursing shortage, which comes up over and over again. There's significant healthcare policy discussions that are happening in the context of an emergency room. It's amazing how you were able to get that all in there, and it doesn't feel crammed in that regard. It feels very active. Like, that is a full hour, and yet it seems like it's a very plausible hour of what would happen in an emergency room. You covered a lot in season 1. And what I already know about season 2 is that it's supposed to take place over July 4th weekend, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, we asked what the least favorite times were in the emergency rooms, and it was Halloween and 4th of July.
I imagine we'll see some fireworks, quite literally, and injuries. Any other scoop you can give us on what you got planned?
I'm not trying to be coy. We just really are back in the writers' room, and Scott Gemmell, who's the executive producer and creator of the show, is working with the writers right now, and we're just starting to lay it out. It will be another shift, just a summer shift instead of a fall shift, which is what we had last time. And so we'll have that 10 months or so in between. So people have changed, things will have happened in their lives. We'll learn a little bit more about them. But again, we're just going to be clocking in at 7 a.m.
Is it coming? Is it airing in July? Is that when you're going to release it?
No, the intent is to be on the same time, which is in mid to early January.
Okay.
Which is when we premiered this year.
Fantastic. This is anything else you want to tell us about that you got going on in your life?
No, just this has been a real pleasure, and I just can't thank enough all of the medical people who work with us and the people we've heard from in the medical community who are now telling us things about their lives. And just the next time you go into an emergency room, be be patient because there's a lot going on. And remember that most of the people there saved lives all through COVID and risk their own life every day.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, there was a lot of banging of the pans and a lot of celebration of those healthcare workers early on. But then, it got tough. It got really tough. It's almost like people's patience wore out despite the fact that the virus was still there. And I don't know, maybe I think the show resonates with people for so many reasons, but the idea that you guys decided to dive right back into something that a lot of people would just as soon have forgotten, I think is very admirable. And it worked.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
It worked for you guys.
Yeah.